Today we continue our sermon series on suffering and hardship in the Christian life, which is appropriate for Lent. And we are focusing on that short gospel reading, and especially the words that Jesus said to Peter, although he didn't call him Peter the rock. He says instead, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. Some of you may remember what that thing is that this woman is holding in this picture. I don't know how many people still use it today, but it was called a flour sifter. And I suppose in the days when flour wasn't as uniformly ground as it is today, you could put your flour through the sifter and you would get a pile of nice and fluffy, pure flour for your baking, and any clots or lumps or anything else that was still left over, you could just throw that away. And sifting wheat is also kind of a purification process. A combine does it today. But in the old days, you'd have to sift it through kind of like a screen, and any bits of plant or dirt or grasshopper heads or anything else that was in there with the wheat would go through, and then you would have nice, pure wheat in that purification process of sifting. Jesus tells Simon, Satan wants to sift all the disciples like wheat. We know the situation because in a very brief amount of time, later in this chapter, Jesus is going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and the disciples are going to fail to even be able to watch and pray 1 hour. Multiple times this happens. And then Jesus, in that same garden, is going to be arrested. And all those disciples will eventually desert him and run away in that time of sifting. And then later on, in the courtyard where Jesus is on trial, Peter is going to deny even the most basic thing of knowing Jesus. 3 times he's going to do that. And so in sifting these disciples, Satan, whose name means the accuser, will be able to point to all these things and say, now see, does a Christian do these things? No. Are these really followers of Jesus? No. How could they even be called your own? We know what God thinks of that argument. In 4 verses there in our gospel reading, Jesus is going to tell Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. He knows that this is going to happen. If I knew that someone was going to my friend was going to betray me like that, I don't know that I would be so caring toward them at that moment as Jesus. But God knows that we are sinners, and still he pours out upon us the forgiveness and grace won at the cross. So maybe what Satan is trying to do in this accusation and in this sifting is not so much try to convince God as try to convince us and make us feel that we are unworthy of the love and forgiveness of God and to be called his followers. Because in sifting, okay, pretend that's, I don't know what I did. Pretend you've got a pile of nastiness in front of you. Pretend that you have sifted something and you get all the dirt and all the grunge and all the grime all in one place. Because sifting does that, right? It puts, that could be a good picture of it. It puts all the good wheat there, but then in another spot you got all the nasty stuff there. Could Satan cause you to look at all the nastiness in your life and say, wow, do I deserve to be called a follower of God? We were supposed to watch our dog, my son's dog this week, and whenever he leaves, we have to clean up. We have to get the Swiffer out, go under the carpets, and then go vacuum and sweep and get under the couch. And you notice there's dog hair, but when you really bring it all in one spot, that's when you say, my goodness, I could make a new dog out of this. It's really, I didn't even know there was this much, But you bring it all in one spot, and then it confronts you face to face with that, like those disciples at night. Imagine that the devil were able to bring all your most nasty thoughts, the worst deeds you ever did in your life, all of that in one spot and put it right in front of you and say, now see, You think you're a disciple? Are you really? I think your faith is fake. I don't think you're really following Christ. I don't think you belong to him. Would you believe the accusation of Satan when he sifts you like that, like he's doing with the disciples here? But there is another side to the sifting. Sifting also brings together in one place all the good stuff, too, that you can look and see the grace and forgiveness of God, even for a sinner like you. And so, Jesus says, there we go, I think. One more. Let's go to where Jesus says, Simon, Simon. Do I have that one? Satan is asked to sift you as wheat. Well, that's a good one. Simon, Simon, Satan is asked to sift all of you as wheat, but after you have turned, strengthen your brothers. And he prays, I have prayed for you so that your faith may not fail. The prayer of Jesus is powerful. Why does he pray for this? First of all, why does he listen to Satan? Satan comes up to Jesus and says, I would like to put all of your disciples through the worst failure experience of their life and the greatest testing of their faith. Why doesn't Jesus say, no, you're Satan, get away. I'm going to protect my disciples from this. Instead, he seems to say, okay, bring it on. Why does he allow this to happen in the disciples' life? And it would have been so easy for this to have been avoided. I read a passage in the Old Testament where an enemy army, thousands and tens of thousands of soldiers, comes in and invades Israel, and God causes the whole army to be blind. And then Elisha comes up to them, the prophet, and says, oh, this isn't the city you want to attack. This isn't the right road you should be on. Follow me this way. And the whole army follows them. A whole army turned blind. It would have been so easy for God to have caused one servant girl not to have seen Peter in the courtyard, or not to have recognized him, or not to have thought to bring it up to everyone around there. And Peter wouldn't have been faced with that, you know. Or why didn't Jesus pray instead, after you've turned, after you've failed and turned back again, why didn't Jesus just pray, when this all temptation comes, lead them not into temptation, or if they face temptation, help them pass with flying colors so that they would suffer all rather than turn away from me. I'm sure the prayer of Jesus would have accomplished that. But instead, he prays, after you've turned, strengthen your brothers. Instead, he prays, I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. I know you're going to, but that afterwards you would be able to turn to me and still believe that the grace of God is real for a sinner like you. Simon, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. But after you've turned, then strengthen your brothers. That you would believe that the grace of God is real for you even after this. And then that you would believe that my love for you continues to exist. And then that you would believe that I've got a purpose for this happening in the first place. And then that you would believe that I've got a purpose for you in this world. Because those other disciples who ran away, they're going to need you, Peter. They're going to need someone who's been in the same place and worse, and has experienced the grace of God. That thing that totally broke you is going to be what everyone else is going to need of these disciples when you turn again. See, after that sifting, Peter had a choice. Am I going to look at the pile of nasty, or am I going to look at what is good and real and true because I am a child of God? After the sifting happens, what's going to be the most important thing in my life, the failure or the grace of God that covers over that failure? And so the theme of this sermon, is that God can use negative events in our life and even our failures for a good purpose. For instance, there was this pastor named Pastor Peter Grieg who lived in England, and he had come to America to spend some time, and while he was here, a volcano exploded in Iceland and canceled all the flights across the Atlantic. That's where that slide goes. And he was upset. He prayed to God and said, I didn't plan for this interruption to my life. I had things I'm supposed to be doing, need to do, duties in my, and here I am helpless, and it's totally pointless, God. Don't see why you're doing this, but I'm telling you, God, okay, this is your interruption, so if you want to use it for anything, if you want me to talk to someone, if you want this interruption to serve your will, your purposes, I'm open to this, whatever you want to do, God. And then he started thinking about sleeping on the floor, and then he started to think, maybe I don't have to spend the night at O'Hare. I've got friends who aren't so far from here, and he started to think about his friends, and then this one friend kept coming into his mind, even though he was farther away. He lived in Madison, Wisconsin. And he thought, okay, that's the name I keep thinking of. So he calls the guy in Madison and says, how would it be if you came and picked me up and I slept on your couch tonight? Now, unbeknown to him, here's where it gets interesting. That friend of his had had some horrible news. And his wife was trying to get him through it, but didn't feel like she was really accomplishing what needed to happen there. And so she said to him, her words, who would you want, if you could have anyone in the world, who would you want sitting on your couch tonight to talk to? And he said, well, Pastor Peter, of course, but that makes no sense because he's never been to my house and he's in England. And then the phone rang. It's neat how God works it out that way sometimes. Actually happened like that to Sarah and me a couple years ago. We thought we were going to have to spend the night at the airport in Houston, remembered that we had friends in Houston, and called one of them and said, how would you like to come pick us up? We'll go out to dinner and then you can put us up for the night. And, and they said, sure. We haven't caught up in a long time. Unbeknownst to us, they had just had something in their family happen that they really wanted to talk over. And it is neat when it works out that way. The point is that God can use things that we don't see the purpose for really and turn them to his purposes, even when to us they're just completely negative. Now, that's not saying it's that way every time. Don't hear me saying that all bad news is just good news. And, sometimes it is just bad. I'm sure there were hundreds of people at O'Hare Airport and Houston Airport, and all they got out of it was a sore back that night because nothing, good happened out of it. You might lose your job. You might get cancer. You might get divorced, whatever. And maybe that's just bad. But what I am saying is that God can use those events. So when you say this is just pointless, this is just purposeless, it's like we can't see a purpose, but maybe God, who is eternal and almighty, maybe he can, and he could well be doing something through those events that we don't even know why, but what we do know is that his love for us is so strong, he can see us through. If the hands that keep the world spinning in our universe could be held helpless to the cross out of love simply for you and me, well, then we can trust him to help us through a time of sifting like this. Because what could God be doing? Well, one thing he could be doing is to wake us up if we need to be woken up. I had a man in my former congregation who wasn't coming to church very much at all for a long time after his divorce. And then I went to visit him in the hospital after a wrench fell from the top of the grain elevator and broke his hard hat and gave him a concussion. And he said to me, Pastor, God doesn't have to hit me on the head a second time to get my attention. Or God could cause traumatic effects to kind of transform us. When you are sifting wheat, there's all kinds of little papery husks and feathery, all kinds of stuff in with the wheat. And you got to separate that all out to get it all purified. And if you were wheat getting sifted to you, what would it feel like? What would it look like? It would feel like your whole world and everything you knew was coming apart. And sometimes God needs to take our world apart so that it can come together again in a better way. Listen again to what our second reading said. Not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom he's given us. Depending on how we react to the situation, God can be working on our character in a good way. I was reading about a guy whose wife left him for another man and took the 2 children with her, initiating a long legal battle, expensive and protracted. And it took years that he lived through, worst time in his life. And he said, though, years later, he could look back and see that his kids, he had more joy in them now than he used to have because his priorities had been rearranged. And now his work and his job and his career were not the all-consuming main thing that they had been. And it freed him up to appreciate those kids more. And he found himself reacting to other people even with more sympathy and love and forgiveness, because having gone through this giant, overwhelming, negative time in his life, he just couldn't react as strongly to the littler things, the smaller things that happened anymore. The suffering had produced an improved character in him. It can also bring people together. I had a friend in seminary who lost a child in infancy, and on the phone with him, he said, I'll tell you one thing I've learned, Greg. He said, when you go through something like this, it'll either drive you apart or it'll pull you closer together. There's a psychologist who said that if you look at people's life goals, they can fall into mainly 4 general categories. The category of personal achievement and happiness, the life goals that fall into the category of relationships and intimacy, the life goals that fall into religion and spirituality, and the life goals that fall into generativity, by which he meant, how am I going to leave the world a better place when I'm gone? How am I going to bless people outside of me? And what he said was that for people who had the majority of their life goals in the top one, the personal achievements and personal happiness, they were the ones most negatively affected by adverse life situations. But the people who had more of their life goals in the last 3, their life goals were often enhanced by negative events in their life. Especially the life goals in spirituality, they can actually bring you closer in your walk to God. I was reading about an event in the life of a missionary whose life goal was to bring the gospel to this Amazon tribe that didn't have a written language. And there was only one man named Pedro that anyone knew who knew both that language and Spanish. And so the work was built around him. And she had gotten together the financing and the volunteers and the framework, and the work was begun. And then Pedro suddenly died. And all the work had to stop because there was no way to go forward. And she was so confused with why God would do this. I mean, isn't this your work I was doing, God? Isn't this what you wanted me to do? Why would you take Pedro, of all the people in the world, and totally stop the evangelism of these people in this tribe? But she realized that she had to let God be God and just trust him. And she realized that up until then, she had been praying that God would bless her goals, as if God were her accomplice rather than God, the Lord of all, who gets to decide these things. And she had to trust him like a child would trust an adult in matters that she had no comprehension of. She even said that she had to eliminate some of these idols in her life that had stepped in front of just trusting and following God, and turn over the exhausting efforts of controlling life for herself and her loved ones and her cause, and just fully trust the God she would never be able to understand, but whose love she knew could see her through. So to sum up, God doesn't want our sufferings to be without purpose. He allows the sifting. He did with his first disciples. He does with us. And he may have a purpose that we see. It might be that God uses our faith in that situation to bless someone else. Or it may be he's accomplishing something that we're always going to be totally oblivious to ever knowing. But we do know this. Jesus prays that our faith will not fail, that we see ourselves in such times as a child of God, and that through it all, we know his love. We know we can trust him. Amen.